All right, welcome back. This is presentation 1 of Chapter 14, Domestic Policy. This is where everything that we've learned in the semester so far is kind of coming together. This is what governments actually do to try and, on the domestic side, to try and improve people's lives. So let's jump into it. These are the key topics. I'm going to assume you can read. Give you about 10 seconds to look it over. And here are the chapter learning objectives. Again, I assume you can read. You should be able to understand what it is that we're trying to do here. All right, so let's jump into this. They begin the chapter, the authors, talking about the child tax credit, and that is something that came up. It's basically a tax kind of complication. It is a way of making sure that you're not taxing people into poverty. Again, the problem is you want people to pay their fair share. Everyone should pay some tax to some extent, but some people are simply not making enough money to basically be able to afford it. And when you require people making under a certain level, to pay tax, you are effectively, negatively affecting their ability to live their day-to-day lives. So the child tax credit is one of the more effective things that government can do to actually improve people's day-to-day lives. So one thing that happened with the COVID-19 pandemic is that both Trump and Biden of course, Trump temporarily expanded the child tax credit. And Biden wanted to actually make those cuts or those expansions permanent with his Build Back Better program. So the story is about Anna, Laura, and Jeremy Finley. They're a couple with 2 young children in West Virginia, living close to poverty, but they were right on the edge. And Anna lost her job during the pandemic when increased costs of child care exceeded her ability to earn enough money to pay for child care. Biden's Build Back Better program and his legislation was designed to basically make permanent the child tax credit that had been raised under Trump. However, he needed, in Congress, you need to get support from both houses of Congress, and West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin believed that the child tax credit would be too expensive, and it would actually fuel inflation. So he argued that he wouldn't support the expansion of the child tax credit without a work requirement. And of course, at the time that this text was written, it probably hadn't gone into effect, but ultimately Biden got the support of Manchin and was able to get the Build Back Better program put into place. Now, again, one interesting thing about this is you would think that the child tax credit would be relatively popular, but in fact, public opinion polls indicate that support for the expansion of the child tax credit was pretty closely divided, with 47% in favor of its expansion and 42% in opposition. So that kind of illustrates the increasingly politically contentious nature of domestic policy. And there are 3 basic things that the federal government is interested in doing. And they do a lot of these things in cooperation both with state and local governments. One, they want to address the risks of things like unemployment and injury that people face in their day-to-day lives. They want to provide opportunities for people through education and make sure that education is available. And then they want to do things to alleviate poverty, because poor people, again, that's the whole point of the child tax credit. Poor people they're not really very good taxpayers because they're simply not making enough money. You want to get those people through that point of poverty to the point where they're making sufficient money that they can pay taxes. Okay. That sounds capitalistic, but again, that's sort of what we're doing here. So the government shapes economic policy with three basic tools. The U.S. Constitution empowers the federal government to take action to establish, maintain, and protect markets. The preamble and Article 1, Section 8 expressly delegate to Congress the authority to lay and collect taxes, to pay the debts, and to provide for the common defense and the general welfare. Also to borrow money, to coin money, and to regulate the value thereof. That is a powerful tool. The fact that we are in control of the printing presses means that we can expand or contract the availability of the money supply in ways that, for example, the European Union countries cannot. The Constitution was silent, however, on how those powers should be deployed, and a lot of the main contentions between Republicans and Democrats are about domestic policy. The tools used to formulate and implement domestic policy have evolved considerably as the economy has become more sophisticated. Decisions about which tools to employ and or how to employ them are not simply technical matters. They reflect deep ideological conflicts over, the role of government in managing the economy. So fiscal policies are anything related with taxing and spending. So again, that is the use of the government's taxing and spending powers to somehow manipulate the economy. And you have to assume that they're manipulating the economy because they want to stimulate it, to strengthen it, to do something. Fiscal policy is generally employed to counteract what is known as the boom and bust nature of the business cycle. In economics, boom and bust refers to the tendency for economic growth to occur in fits and starts, with rapid growth often contributing to inflation. And that again means too much money chasing too few goods. That's one of the common ways of looking at it. It's not the only way that inflation happens, but it's one of the more common ways. So as inflation spreads, people decline to pay for goods and services that are judged too expensive, which may lead to unemployment, which may lead to a contraction of the economy as fewer and fewer people are out there spending money. So the goal of economic policy, the goal of fiscal policy, is to produce slow and steady growth. Especially in an economy of our size, you're not going to see, 6-8% growth in GDP in an economy the size of the United States. You want to prevent the economy from overheating, which means again this idea of creating inflationary pressures. So, what factors have contributed to inflation today? And again, I think the pandemic has an enormous role to play. First and foremost, it caused a lot of people to be out of work for considerable periods of time. It also, in creating unemployment, it also created a lot of government spending. And again, the government spending was probably good spending, but it has an effect on the economy. And likewise, it also disrupted a number of supply chains, so that there was especially goods coming into the country got stuck outside of ports because they simply couldn't get goods in fast enough. And then you also have problems with chip shortages and things like that, and with things like cars and stuff like that. So taxation, for most of the 19th century, taxation was relatively modest, and the scope of the federal government and what they were doing didn't require much in the way of revenue. The federal government's primary source of revenue came from tariffs, which are taxes on imported goods. And between 1816 and 1945, the United States relied heavily on the taxation of imported goods, and tariffs constituted the majority of U.S. the federal budget. And our tariffs were among the highest in the world. Okay. The progressive era saw the establishment of new sources of funding for the federal government. In particular, of course, you got the 16th Amendment, basically establishing the individual income tax, which income taxes are the most efficient way for a government to raise revenue. and some would say the most just, depending on how how the tax scheme is created. The creation of Social Security in 1935 provided a significantly expanded source of federal revenue, because again, remember, Social Security is only giving out money to those people who are now eligible, and there's tons and tons of people paying into the system, which means up until a certain point, more money is going into the Social Security system than is going out. And what was happening up until fairly recently is that when more money was coming in that was being dispersed to recipients, that money would then go to, you would use that money to purchase bonds, and that money would go into the general revenue. So again, that's a significant amount of kind of funny money, if you will, which is something that we fought about in the 2000 election, and the responsible people lost. The largest share of federal revenue today comes in individual income taxes. Nearly half of all federal revenues come in the form of personal income taxes. Over the course of the 20th century, the share of federal revenue derived from income has varied. And again, one of the main goals of the federal taxation is to ensure something that economists describe as redistribution, which is controversial, but the objective is generally to tax and spend in such a way as to reduce disparities of wealth between the lowest and highest income brackets. Many Americans object to the idea of redistribution as a violation of individual autonomy, but other Americans believe that in many instances inequality is the result of arbitrary factors, the fact that you were born into wealth rather than or born into poverty for that matter. Taxes can be progressive or regressive depending on which demographic groups a tax burdens most heavily. So for example, our income tax is progressive, which is to say it is designed to fall more heavily on the wealthy. Again, the more money you make, the higher your tax bracket, a larger proportion of your income is going to be taken in income taxes. In contrast, Social Security taxes, once you hit a certain level of income, you no longer are paying Social Security taxes. So Social Security falls more heavily on less well-off people. Sales taxes are also innately regressive in that poor people end up having to pay a much larger share of their income overall. Wealthy people can set money aside, so they're not spending money and ergo having to pay sales taxes. This chart kind of shows you how much in 1966, over 1/5, close to a quarter of all the federal revenues were coming from corporate income tax, and today it's now well below 10%. And a lot of economists, I shouldn't say most, a lot of economists would say that corporations should be paying a higher rate, but they've been very effective at gaming the system and ensuring that they pay as little tax as possible. Americans side by side, a lot of Americans complain about how high their tax rates are. And again, part of it is because, I think I mentioned this in the chapter on state and local government, it's because we're paying from so many different sources. We're getting hit at so many different levels. Federal, state, and local, they all take a bite, and a lot of people get frustrated by that. And that's understandable. But when you look at the overall rate of taxation, it's really relatively low when you compare it to other countries. Most other countries take a much larger bite, but their governments also provide much more aggressive public services. So that's it for this slide. When we come back, we will continue our discussion with domestic policy.